The moon goddess never breaks a true bond, sometimes she simply hides it where no one thinks to look. The silver bells of Blackstone Citadel echoed across the mountain valley as hundreds of wolves gathered beneath a sky washed in moonlight. Their polished armor reflected the glow of towering crystal braziers, while banners carrying the royal crest drifted in the cool autumn breeze. Every eye remained fixed on the ancient stone platform where Alpha King Daemon Blackwood stood in silence, his broad shoulders wrapped in a midnight cloak that seemed to swallow the light around him. At only 30 years old, Daemon had become the most respected ruler in the Northern Territories, feared for his unwavering judgment and admired for the peace he had forged between rival packs. Tonight, however, the kingdom had gathered for something far more personal. They believed they were about to witness destiny itself. Evelyn Carter climbed the marble steps with trembling hands, hidden beneath the sleeves of her pale blue ceremonial dress. Her soft blonde hair rested over one shoulder, and despite the whispers surrounding her humble upbringing, she carried herself with quiet dignity. She had spent years believing the invisible thread between her soul and the Alpha King would one day lead her here. Every lesson from her late mother, every prayer beneath the full moon, every lonely hope had pointed toward this single moment. The air itself seemed to pause as she stopped only a few feet from Daemon. Elders smiled knowingly. Nobles exchanged confident glances. Even the wolves surrounding the courtyard lowered their voices, expecting the sacred bond to be sealed before the kingdom. Instead, Daemon looked into Evelyn's hopeful blue eyes with an expression so carefully controlled that it felt colder than the mountain wind. His voice carried clearly across the silent courtyard. "I cannot accept this bond." The words were calm, respectful, final. A ripple of stunned silence swept through the gathering before hushed murmurs spread like leaves caught in a storm. Evelyn blinked once, convinced she had misunderstood. The moonlight still surrounded them. The sacred markings beneath their feet still glowed softly. Yet nothing happened. No celebration. No blessing. Only silence. Daemon lowered his gaze for a brief moment, as though wrestling with something unseen, before stepping back from the ceremonial circle. The elders exchanged uneasy looks, uncertain whether to continue or end the ritual. Evelyn felt every heartbeat echo inside her chest. She had prepared herself for many possibilities, but never this one. She offered the smallest nod she could manage, refusing to let tears fall before the watching crowd. If the Alpha King had made his choice, then she would meet it with the last piece of pride she still possessed. Without another word, she turned and descended the stone steps alone. The whispers followed her through the courtyard. Some pitied her. Others quietly questioned how destiny itself could fail. None of them noticed the faint silver shimmer that flickered across Evelyn's hand before disappearing beneath her sleeve. None of them noticed Daemon watching her leave with a shadow of regret crossing his face for only a heartbeat before duty buried it once again. And neither of them could possibly know that beneath Evelyn's breaking heart, another heartbeat had already begun, carrying a future powerful enough to change the fate of the entire kingdom. 3 weeks passed before Evelyn understood why the strange silver shimmer had lingered beneath her skin since the ceremony. She had traveled far beyond the Northern Territories, leaving behind the towering walls of Blackstone Citadel and settling in a quiet village where no one recognized the woman who had once stood before an Alpha King. The little cottage she rented overlooked a peaceful lake surrounded by pine trees, and each morning she greeted the sunrise with the determination to begin again. The rejection still lived quietly inside her heart, but she refused to let it define the rest of her life. She found work helping the village healer organize herbs, prepare warm teas, and comfort families who came seeking simple remedies. Her gentle nature quickly earned the trust of neighbors who knew nothing about the royal ceremony or the whispers that had followed her departure. Then one crisp morning, everything changed. The elderly healer smiled gently after completing a careful examination and placed both hands over Evelyn's trembling fingers. "You are going to have a baby," she said softly. The room became perfectly still. Evelyn stared through the small window as golden leaves drifted across the yard, unable to speak. Her first emotion was not fear but disbelief. She remembered the sacred ceremony beneath the full moon, the bond that had almost been completed before Daemon had stepped away. Somehow, despite the rejection, a miracle had already begun. Tears gathered in her eyes, not from sorrow this time, but from the overwhelming realization that she would never truly be alone again. That evening she walked beside the quiet lake until the stars appeared overhead. She rested one hand across her stomach and whispered promises carried away by the cool breeze. She promised her child a home filled with kindness instead of pride, honesty instead of titles, and love that would never depend upon rank or power. She also made one difficult promise to herself. Damon would never be told. Not because she wished to punish him, but because she believed he had already chosen the life he wanted. She would not place a child into a palace where duty always seemed stronger than the heart. Far away, inside Blackstone Citadel, Damon found little peace despite returning to the rhythm of royal responsibilities. Every council meeting, every treaty, and every ceremonial gathering felt strangely incomplete. The invisible connection he believed should have disappeared after the rejection continued to linger like an unanswered question. At unexpected moments he would pause in the middle of a conversation, sensing a warmth that faded before he could understand it. The royal advisors assured him the feeling would pass with time, but time only made it more mysterious. Some nights he stood alone on the palace balcony overlooking the forests below, convinced he could almost hear someone calling from beyond the mountains. He dismissed it as exhaustion and buried himself deeper in work. Neither Damon nor Evelyn realized that the bond had not been broken. It had simply found another heartbeat to protect. Beneath the calm rhythm of Evelyn's growing child rested a quiet strength unlike anything the kingdom had seen in generations, and with every passing day the future moved silently toward a destiny neither distance nor regret would be able to stop. 5 years slipped by with the quiet certainty of changing seasons, and the little cottage beside the lake slowly became a home filled with laughter instead of sorrow. Evelyn never spoke bitterly about the past. To her young son, the world was not divided by titles, crowns, or old disappointments. It was measured by kindness, honesty, and the willingness to help someone who needed it. She named him Noah Carter, and from the day he learned to walk, he carried an unusual calm that seemed to settle every room he entered. His hair was as pale as sunlit wheat, his smile gentle, and his bright silver eyes often caught strangers by surprise. More than once, travelers paused in the village simply to ask whose child possessed such remarkable eyes. Evelyn always answered with the same quiet smile. "He is my greatest blessing." Noah loved exploring the forests surrounding the lake, although he never wandered farther than his mother allowed. Every afternoon after helping gather herbs, he raced along winding trails, greeting birds, rabbits, and even nervous deer with remarkable ease. Animals that normally fled from people seemed strangely comfortable around him. The elderly healer often watched from the garden with thoughtful eyes before murmuring that nature recognized hearts before names. Noah did not fully understand those words, but he remembered them. At home, Evelyn taught him to read beside the fireplace, to care for injured birds without fear, and to treat every stranger with respect regardless of how they dressed or where they came from. She wanted him to grow into a man who valued compassion above power. Yet there were moments she could not explain. During every full moon, Noah's silver eyes reflected the light with an almost luminous glow. Once, after scraping his hand while climbing over a fallen tree, the tiny cut disappeared before Evelyn could finish wrapping it with a clean cloth. Another evening, a frightened horse broke free from its wagon during a thunderstorm. While the adults shouted in panic, Noah quietly stepped forward, placed one small hand against the horse's neck, and spoke in a calm voice until the frightened animal lowered its head peacefully. The villagers called it extraordinary. Evelyn called it a gift. Deep inside, however, she wondered if the mysterious bond she had once believed broken still echoed through her son's life. Hundreds of miles away, Blackstone Citadel no longer felt like the thriving kingdom it had once been. Damon fulfilled every duty expected of a wise alpha king, yet something invisible continued to weigh upon his spirit. His closest advisors noticed that he smiled less often and spent longer hours studying old royal records concerning ancient mate bonds and forgotten prophecies. Every explanation ended with the same conclusion. Once rejected, a sacred bond should disappear forever. But Damon still sensed it. Sometimes while attending council meetings, he would suddenly pause, distracted by the unmistakable feeling that someone precious was safe somewhere beyond the mountains. Other times, he dreamed of a quiet lake, a wooden cottage, and the distant laughter of a child whose face he could never quite see before waking. He dismissed each dream as coincidence, but the feeling refused to leave him. Unknown to both mother and father, destiny had been patiently weaving their separate lives toward the same moment. The invisible thread neither of them could see had only grown stronger with every passing year, waiting for the day when one small act of kindness would bring the hidden heir of the Northern Territories into the path of the father who never knew he existed. The first snow of the season arrived quietly, dusting the rooftops of the lakeside village in white and turning every pine branch into a glittering sculpture beneath the morning sun. Noah could hardly contain his excitement as he bundled himself into a warm wool coat and hurried outside with a small basket in his hands. Evelyn smiled from the doorway before reminding him not to wander too far beyond the familiar trails. He nodded eagerly, promising he would be back before supper. Gathering herbs beneath fresh snow had become one of their favorite traditions because the rare winter roots hidden beneath the frozen ground often helped the village healer prepare medicines for the cold months ahead. As Noah followed the narrow forest path, he heard a faint whimper carried by the wind. He immediately stopped walking. The sound came again, softer this time, somewhere beyond a cluster of snow-covered rocks. Carefully setting down his basket, he stepped closer until he discovered a young silver wolf curled beneath a fallen cedar branch. One of its front paws was trapped between two heavy roots, and although it looked frightened, it made no attempt to growl at the boy standing nearby. Noah slowly knelt several feet away, remembering everything his mother had taught him about frightened animals. "It is all right," he whispered gently. "I am not here to hurt you." The little wolf watched him with bright golden eyes that seemed unusually intelligent. Instead of pulling against the roots, it relaxed as Noah carefully brushed away the snow and lifted the loose branch enough for the trapped paw to slide free. The young wolf stood, favoring one leg for only a moment before placing its weight on all four paws again as though the discomfort had already faded. It stepped forward, touched its nose lightly against Noah's hand, and disappeared into the trees almost as quickly as it had appeared. Noah smiled, believing the encounter had simply been another quiet blessing of the forest, then gathered his basket and returned toward the village without realizing he had just helped someone far more important than an ordinary wolf. Less than a mile away, hidden among towering evergreens, 3 royal scouts emerged from the shadows with expressions of complete disbelief. They had spent 2 exhausting days searching for the missing royal wolf cub entrusted to their protection during a diplomatic journey through the northern forests. Moments earlier they had feared they would return to Blackstone Citadel having failed their mission. Instead, they had witnessed a small village boy calmly free the frightened cub without fear, anger, or reward. Even more astonishing, they had watched the animal's limp disappear almost instantly after the child touched its paw. Captain Rowan Mercer lowered his spyglass slowly, unable to explain what he had seen. "Did you notice the boy's eyes?" one of the scouts asked quietly. Rowan nodded without taking his gaze from the distant child. "Silver." The exact shade carried only by the royal bloodline of House Blackwood. Back inside Blackstone Citadel later that evening, Damon stood before the great fireplace listening to reports from every corner of the kingdom when Rowan entered the council chamber carrying unexpected news. The seasoned captain described the missing cub, the unknown village, and the remarkable boy who had rescued it with unusual calm. Damon thanked him for recovering the royal animal, but one detail refused to leave his thoughts. A child with silver eyes living quietly beyond the borders. For reasons he could not explain, an old warmth stirred inside his chest the instant he heard those words. Without realizing it, he stepped toward the nearest window overlooking the snow-covered mountains, his heartbeat strangely unsteady as though destiny itself had quietly whispered that the search he had abandoned years ago was finally beginning again. 2 days later, the royal convoy arrived in the lakeside village under a quiet winter sky, not with the thunder of conquest but with the measured dignity expected of the Northern Territories. Snow crunched beneath polished boots as Captain Rowan Mercer stepped down from his horse, carrying the young silver wolf beside him. The playful cub immediately lifted its head, sniffed the crisp air, and without hesitation bounded toward the familiar cottage near the frozen lake. Evelyn looked up from hanging bundles of dried herbs beneath the porch roof, surprised to see the animal racing toward her home. Before she could react, Noah burst through the front door with a joyful laugh. "You came back," he called, kneeling as the little wolf happily nudged against his shoulder. Rowan watched the reunion in thoughtful silence. Wild creatures did not normally seek out strangers twice, especially royal wolves carefully bred for the palace. Yet this cub behaved as though it had returned to family. Evelyn greeted the visitors with calm courtesy, inviting them inside from the cold. The modest cottage smelled of pine wood, cinnamon, and fresh bread cooling beside the fireplace. Nothing about the home suggested wealth, but everything reflected warmth and quiet care. Rowan thanked her for her hospitality before explaining that the royal wolf had wandered away from the convoy several days earlier and that Noah's kindness had ensured its safe return. Evelyn smiled gently, proud but unsurprised. "He has always believed every living creature deserves compassion," she said. Rowan's attention shifted toward Noah, who was carefully pouring warm water into a small wooden bowl for the cub. The captain noticed the child's silver eyes again. In the soft afternoon light they looked almost identical to those of the Blackwood family portraits displayed throughout Blackstone Citadel. The resemblance was impossible to ignore, yet Rowan refused to draw conclusions without evidence. Instead, he asked simple questions. Noah answered politely, speaking with remarkable confidence for a 5-year-old. He explained how he enjoyed helping his mother gather herbs, reading adventure stories beside the fireplace, and exploring the forest without ever harming the animals that lived there. There was no arrogance in his voice, only genuine curiosity about the world around him. Rowan found himself unexpectedly impressed. Before leaving, he thanked Evelyn once more and offered a small carved wooden wolf as a token of the kingdom's gratitude. She accepted only after ensuring it was given freely rather than as payment, teaching Noah that kindness should never be measured by rewards. As the convoy disappeared beyond the snow-covered hills, Rowan remained unusually quiet. The questions forming in his mind had grown impossible to dismiss. That evening he returned to Blackstone Citadel and requested a private audience with Daemon. Standing before the great map of the Northern Territories, Rowan carefully described everything he had witnessed, from the remarkable bond between the child and the royal cub to the peaceful cottage beside the lake. Daemon listened patiently until one detail stopped him completely. "His eyes," Rowan said quietly. "They are silver, Your Majesty. Not merely light grey. Silver." An unfamiliar stillness settled over the chamber. Daemon slowly turned toward the tall palace windows where snow drifted across the courtyard outside. Without warning, the strange invisible warmth that had haunted him for years flooded through his chest with greater strength than ever before. It lasted only a few seconds, yet it felt unmistakably real. For the first time since the moonlit ceremony years earlier, he no longer believed fate had simply disappeared. Somewhere beyond the mountains, someone was waiting, and every instinct within the Alpha King suddenly urged him to find the truth before another season slipped quietly away. The journey to the lakeside village took 2 full days through snow-covered forests and frozen mountain roads, yet Daemon insisted on traveling with only a small escort instead of a royal procession. He told his council he wished to thank the family who had protected the royal wolf, but deep inside he knew that was only part of the truth. Since hearing Rowan's report, the strange connection that had haunted him for years had become impossible to ignore. Every mile seemed to strengthen the quiet pull inside his chest, guiding him toward something he could neither explain nor resist. As the village finally appeared beyond the pines, Daemon noticed how peaceful everything felt. Children laughed while building snow figures, smoke drifted from stone chimneys, and neighbors greeted one another with easy smiles. It was a life untouched by palace politics, and for the first time in many years he found himself wondering what might have happened had he chosen a different path on that moonlit night. Rowan led him toward the small cottage beside the frozen lake. Before anyone could knock, the front door opened and Noah stepped outside carrying a bucket of birdseed. The little boy stopped in surprise when he saw the visitors. His silver eyes met Daemon's across the snowy yard, and in that single instant the world seemed to fall completely silent. Daemon had stood before thousands of warriors without hesitation, yet now he could not move. Something deep within him responded with overwhelming certainty, not as a command, but as recognition. Noah tilted his head with innocent curiosity before offering the warm smile he gave every stranger. "Hello," he said politely. "Are you here to see the little wolf again?" Damon tried to answer, but his voice caught unexpectedly. He finally managed a quiet greeting while stepping closer. The royal wolf cub suddenly raced from behind the cottage and happily circled both Noah and Damon before sitting between them with its tail wagging enthusiastically, as though celebrating a reunion neither of them understood. Rowan watched carefully without interrupting. Evelyn appeared in the doorway moments later, carrying a basket of freshly baked bread. The instant she saw Damon, every color seemed to drain from her face. For several heartbeats neither of them spoke. 5 years disappeared beneath the weight of one silent glance. Damon saw the same gentle strength he had never forgotten, while Evelyn saw the man she had spent years trying to leave behind. Noah looked from one adult to the other, sensing an unfamiliar tension without understanding its cause. "Mother," he asked softly, "do you know him?" Evelyn steadied herself before answering with quiet grace. "Yes," she replied. "We met a long time ago." Damon noticed the careful distance in her voice, and regret settled even more deeply into his heart. As they entered the cottage, Noah eagerly showed the carved wooden wolf Rowan had given him and spoke excitedly about the forest, the birds, and the coming spring. Damon listened with quiet admiration. The child's kindness, calm confidence, and thoughtful questions reminded him of someone he had once believed deserved far more than he had given her. Then Noah reached for a family sketch resting on the fireplace mantel. It showed only Evelyn holding him as an infant beside the lake. "It is my favorite picture," Noah said proudly. "It is just mother and me because I have never met my father." The room became perfectly still. Damon looked from the smiling child to Evelyn's silent face, and the invisible bond within him flared with unmistakable clarity. For the first time, he no longer questioned whether destiny had survived. The only question left was how much of his own heart he had unknowingly left behind 5 years earlier. The ride back to Blackstone Citadel was the longest journey Damon had ever taken, even though the distance had not changed. Every mile carried the weight of unanswered questions, and every memory from 5 years earlier returned with painful clarity. He could still see Evelyn standing beneath the moonlight in her pale blue dress, offering quiet dignity after hearing words no heart should have endured. At the time he had believed rejecting the bond would protect the kingdom from an ancient prophecy that warned a royal heir born during an unstable lunar cycle would face extraordinary trials. He had chosen duty over hope, convincing himself that sacrifice was the price of responsible leadership. Now that decision no longer felt noble. It felt unbearably incomplete. Upon returning to the palace, Damon ordered the royal archives opened before sunrise. Ancient scrolls, forgotten journals, and centuries of ceremonial records covered the great oak table inside the library. Rowan remained beside him as scholars searched for any reference to a rejected bond that continued to exist. Hours passed before the oldest historian carefully unfolded a weathered parchment bearing the seal of the first Alpha Kings. The faded words described a rare blessing known as the hidden bond. According to the ancient record, if two destined souls were separated before the sacred connection fully awakened, the bond could survive by protecting the innocent life born from that destiny until truth was finally restored. Silence settled across the library. Damon closed his eyes as every unexplained feeling from the past 5 years suddenly made perfect sense. He had never truly lost the bond because it had never been broken. It had simply been waiting. The following morning Damon requested a formal gathering of the royal council. Nobles, elders, and advisors filled the great hall, expecting another discussion about winter trade routes. Instead, the Alpha King stood before them. With unusual calm, he spoke not as a ruler defending his reputation, but as a man determined to face the consequences of his own choices. He admitted that the bond he had rejected had never disappeared and revealed that new evidence suggested an heir connected to the royal bloodline might already exist. Shock spread quietly through the chamber. Some council members questioned the possibility, while others exchanged uneasy glances after remembering the old prophecies they had dismissed years earlier. Damon silenced every debate with a single decision. He announced that Evelyn Carter and her son would be invited to Blackstone Citadel as honored guests, not subjects under investigation. Their dignity would be protected, their privacy respected, and no judgment would be made before the complete truth was known. Hundreds of miles away, A royal messenger arrived at the little cottage beside the frozen lake carrying a sealed invitation embossed with the Blackwood crest. Evelyn read the carefully written letter twice before lowering it into her lap. There were no commands, no demands, and no threats. Only a respectful request for her and Noah to visit the palace so long separated questions could finally receive honest answers. Noah looked up with bright curiosity after noticing the thoughtful expression on his mother's face. "Are we going somewhere?" he asked. Evelyn glanced through the window toward the quiet lake that had sheltered their peaceful life for 5 years. Then she looked back at her son, whose silver eyes reflected the winter sunlight exactly as they had reflected the moon on the night everything changed. She gently folded the letter, took a slow breath, and realized that the future she had spent years avoiding had finally found its way to her front door. The journey to Blackstone Citadel began before sunrise, with fresh snow sparkling beneath a pale winter sky as Evelyn and Noah rode beside the royal escort through the winding mountain roads. Noah's excitement grew with every passing mile. He had never traveled beyond the quiet villages surrounding the lake, and every towering pine forest, frozen waterfall, and distant castle wall filled him with wonder. Evelyn, however, felt each familiar landmark awaken memories she had carefully buried. 5 years earlier she had left these mountains believing she would never return. Now destiny was leading her back through the very gates she once walked away from with a broken heart. As the massive stone towers of Blackstone Citadel appeared above the cliffs, Noah gazed upward in amazement. "It looks like it touches the clouds," he whispered. Evelyn smiled gently, grateful that her son could see beauty where she still remembered sorrow. The palace gates opened slowly, revealing rows of royal guards standing respectfully along the entrance. There were no mocking whispers, no curious laughter, and no grand display intended to embarrass her. Instead, every person lowered their head in quiet respect as Evelyn and Noah entered the courtyard. Damon had personally ordered that no one would treat them as visitors under suspicion. They would be welcomed with the honor owed to guests whose dignity mattered. Standing at the top of the marble staircase, Damon waited alone. He wore no ceremonial crown and carried no royal staff. He wanted nothing to stand between himself and the truth he had avoided for far too long. When Evelyn stepped onto the first stair, their eyes met once again. Neither of them spoke immediately. The silence carried years of unanswered questions more honestly than words ever could. Noah looked from his mother to Damon before offering a polite smile. "Hello again," he said warmly. Damon returned the smile, and for the first time in many years it reached his eyes. "Welcome," he replied softly. "I am grateful that both of you came." Later that afternoon, the three of them met inside a quiet garden enclosed by ancient stone walls where snow rested gently upon evergreen branches. Damon asked the servants to leave them alone. There were no advisors, no council members, and no witnesses. Only 3 lives connected by choices made long ago. Damon finally broke the silence. He admitted that he had rejected the sacred bond because he believed an ancient prophecy warned that accepting it would place the kingdom and any future heir in danger. He confessed that fear had disguised itself as wisdom, convincing him that walking away was an act of protection rather than abandonment. Evelyn listened without interruption. When he finished, she looked toward Noah, who was happily feeding small birds from a nearby bench. "You made your decision believing it was right," she said quietly. "I made mine for the same reason. I never told you about Noah because I believed he deserved a peaceful childhood free from palace expectations." Damon lowered his head, understanding that they had both sacrificed something precious while believing they were protecting others. Then Noah walked back toward them, holding a tiny feather that had drifted into his mitten. He handed it to Damon with an innocent smile. "Mother says every feather reminds us that hope always finds its way home." Damon accepted the feather carefully, feeling its simple weight in his hand. At that moment he understood that forgiveness could never be demanded by a king, earned through titles, or granted by destiny alone. It would have to be built one honest choice at a time, beginning not with reclaiming the past, but with becoming the father and the man both Evelyn and Noah deserved to know. Several weeks passed before the great hall of Blackstone Citadel welcomed every leader of the Northern Territories beneath one roof. The gathering had originally been scheduled to celebrate the first signs of spring, But rumors had already spread that the Alpha King intended to make an announcement unlike any in the kingdom's history. Sunlight poured through towering stained glass windows, filling the ancient chamber with warm colors that replaced the long shadows of winter. Daemon stood before the assembled council without wearing his ceremonial cloak, choosing instead the simple black attire of a guardian rather than the distant image of a ruler. Evelyn entered beside Noah with quiet confidence, no longer hiding in the background or lowering her eyes before those of higher rank. 5 years of building a peaceful life had given her a strength that neither titles nor approval could create. The hall grew completely silent as Noah looked around with innocent curiosity, unaware that every person present was watching him. Daemon stepped forward and spoke with a calm voice that carried to every corner of the chamber. He admitted before the entire kingdom that the greatest mistake of his life had not been trusting fear instead of destiny. He explained the forgotten prophecy, the hidden bond preserved through an innocent child, and the truth he had discovered too late. Then he turned toward Evelyn. "Years ago," he said, "I believed protecting the future meant walking away from the person the moon had chosen for me. I understand now that real strength is not found in fear. It is found in trust, compassion, and the courage to admit when we are wrong." No one interrupted. Even the oldest elders remained still. Daemon then knelt before Evelyn, not as an Alpha King seeking obedience, but as a man asking for the chance to earn forgiveness. "I cannot ask you to erase the past," he continued. "I can only promise that every day ahead will honor the life you built and the son you raised with more wisdom than I showed." Tears shimmered in many eyes throughout the hall, yet Evelyn did not answer immediately. She looked first at Noah, who smiled gently and reached for both of their hands without understanding the full weight of the moment. Only then did she speak. "Forgiveness is not a single moment," she said softly. "It is something we choose again and again through our actions." Daemon nodded, accepting her words with gratitude rather than disappointment. The council formally recognized Noah as the rightful heir to the House of Blackwood, but the little boy seemed far more interested in showing the royal wolf cub the feather he had carefully kept since their meeting in the garden. Gentle laughter filled the hall, easing years of quiet sorrow in a single shared moment. As evening settled over the kingdom, Daemon, Evelyn, and Noah stood together on the palace balcony overlooking forests beginning to bloom beneath the first full moon of spring. No grand miracle appeared in the sky. No ancient voice declared their destiny complete. Instead, there was something far more meaningful. There was peace. The invisible bond that had survived rejection, distance, and time no longer carried regret. It carried hope. And from that night forward, the people of the Northern Territories remembered that their greatest king was not the one who never made mistakes, but the one who possessed the humility to correct them, while the greatest queen was the woman who transformed heartbreak into kindness, raising a son whose gentle heart united a kingdom long before he ever wore a crown.